Lena, it's you. Your laptop, so you're...
No, I'm good.
No? All right. Maybe you'll have better luck with the full screen.
Yeah, we'll try.
Yeah.
Hopefully I'm not dressed.
Weird.
Yes, I did. F11, full screen.
I tried that.
No. Amazing.
No. F11.
I even tried pressing the FN then.
But the laptop recognizes fingerprint, obviously.
No. Go away, Ubuntu. Drunk.
What's the name of the ice lock countries? Presentation is at least a little bit better.
Yeah, okay.
To get rid of that picture bar.
Okay, so good morning everybody, and today I'm going to present this novel technique we propose for preserving temporal record linkage. Some of you may have seen these slides before. This presentation has been presented at the last year ICDM conference in Singapore, and this research work has been done collaboratively with Professor Peter and funded by the two ARC projects mentioned in there. And I'm not going to detail what is actually meant by record linkage because most of you in here know about what is record linkage is. But record linkage is a process using data integration where you try to link different number of databases together and identify which records in these databases belong to the same entity or not. And once you finish, you identify these matching records, and they can be used by different researchers or data analysis for different analysis purposes. So how it works, it's a stepwise process. You have different steps, each has its own purpose. The first step is the blocking, where you try to do some grouping, try to group the similar records together so that you try to minimize the number of unwanted comparisons as much as possible. And once you have the set of blocks, you compare the different records come from different databases together and try to identify which is the match and which is the non-match. And sometimes due to the classification model you use, it will have some doubts about the decision you make. So these records have to go through a clerical review process. So it will be given to an expert, and he will see, okay, which records belong to which entity or not. So the purpose of this research is mainly about the temporal record linkage. Compared to the traditional record linkage, what we generally do is we try to incorporate the temporal information into the record linkage process. Because if you think about the traditional record linkage process, it generally assumes the databases as static, no changes are possible, so you just compare the record value together, get the similarities, and pass them into a classification model, and based on the similarity vectors, you generally classify them as matches or non-matches. But in realistic scenarios, people do change their names and addresses more often. So if you think about the address, people do change their address more recently compared to last name, but there can be scenarios where a person might change his or her last name as well. For an example, a woman can marry to a person and change her last name, something like that. So if you have these changes in your records, how can you capture them and incorporate into the record linkage process? So this is the problem that we try to achieve. So if you can see in this example table in here, you have record R1 and R4 of the entity E1 has the same first name but changed her last name after 5 years and living in Sydney but in two different locations. So if you think about the traditional record linkage process, if you compare the last name attribute and the street address, you might get very low similarity values. So eventually they will classify as non-matches. So what we try to do is incorporate these changes into the record linkage process so that you adjust the similarity values and ultimately they will be classified as matches. So the idea behind this, how you incorporate these temporal changes into the record linkage process is by calculating the probabilities that how often these changes occurs in your dataset. So in 2011, Lee and others introduced this concept known as decays, and decays is just calculating how often a person might change his or her attribute values, or how often two or more people share the same attribute values. So they introduced these two different probability values known as disagreement decay and agreement decay, where in the disagreement decay you calculate the likelihood that a person change his or her attribute values over a given period of time, while in the agreement decay you calculate how often or what's the likelihood that two or more people share the same attribute value over a given period of time. And we did some experiments on the North Carolina voter registration data set, and we calculate the disagreement decay and the agreement decay probabilities. And as you can see in the right hand side plot, the disagreement decay increases monotonically with the time, while in the agreement decay just stays constant along the time period, because the agreement decay generally relies on the number of distinct values you have for a given attribute in data set. So for this research, we only use disagreement decay in our approach. So the problem that we try to achieve is how we can do it in a privacy-preserving way. So in order to do that, we have to calculate the decay probabilities in a secure manner, because we don't want to reveal about how often these changes occur to the other participants in the linkage process. So we have to ensure that it's done in a much more secure manner. And then once we calculate those probabilities, we have to incorporate these into a kind of an encoding mechanism, and these encodings can be used to calculate the similarities between the records. So what we are proposing is a three-party protocol where we use a third party known as a linkage unit to conduct the linkage process, and we calculate the similarities based on the temporal distances between the record pairs. And to calculate the probabilities, we use a secure multi-party computation technique, and by using those probabilities, we encode them into the Bloom filters, and then these Bloom filters are sent to the linkage unit, so he would do the classification for us. And even though this protocol is being generally proposed as a three-party one, it can be easily extended to multiple databases as well. So how it works? So our approach contains three phases. The first phase is secure decay generation, where we use a secure multi-party computation technique to calculate the probabilities. And once we do that, we move to the second phase, where we encode each and every record into a Bloom filter. And once we have the decay probabilities and the Bloom filters, we send them to the linkage unit, where he do the classification, and he identify which record or which record pairs are the matches, and these matching IDs are sent back to the database owners or data custodians, so they can use for their own analysis purposes. So in phase one, the first thing we need to do is to identify the specific time intervals that can be used for decay generation. To identify the intervals, we follow a secure multi-party computation technique, and in that process, we ensure each time interval contains at least records about at least k entities, just to ensure it follows k anonymous privacy for the entities. And once we have that in time intervals, each party can compute the change count in the sense we count how often a person change his or her attribute values, or how often we get two entities share the same attribute values. And once we have those changes, we follow a homomorphic encryption technique, where each party encrypt them and send them to the linkage unit, where he does the summation and send the result back to the parties, while they decrypt it and then calculate the probabilities they want. So in the second phase is where we do the encoding. So the first thing is we have those attribute values, and each party encode each of these attribute value into a Bloom filter. For encoding purposes, we use these record level Bloom filters proposed by Elizabeth Zarham in 2012. The idea behind record level Bloom filter is we first encode each attribute value in its own Bloom filter, concatenate them, and permute the bit position according to a random sequence agreed by the parties. And once all the parties generate their own set of Bloom filters, one of the parties has to generate a set of bit vectors known as masking keys. So if you can remember, in the previous slide I mentioned that we have to adjust the similarities according to the temporal distances between the record pairs. So the idea behind masking key is when you perform the similarity calculation between the record pairs, we use these masking keys to hide certain number of bit positions so that they won't be contributing to the similarity computation later on. So I'll just show you how it works. So this is an example where we have 3 records belong to entity E2. So in the first instance, she's name is Anne and Miller and lives in Canberra. And after 2 years, she changed her name to Smith and still lives in the same place. But after 5 years, she's changed her last name still Smith, but she moves to Melbourne. So if you think about if you encode each of these records in its own Bloom filter, you will have this R4, R2, R4, and R2 and R5 like this, and you want to compare these together. And depending on the time interval we will have our own masking key. And the idea behind masking key is, so each time interval will have a specific probability value, decay probabilities, and depending on that decay probabilities, we will select the number of bits that needs to be set in each of these masking keys. So you can see that in the 2-year interval, the street has a decay probability of 0.2, while it has been increased to 0.8 after a 5-year gap, because there is a high likelihood that people will change their addresses within a given 5-year gap compared to a 2-year gap. So you can see that in the 2-year gap, we have 3 set bits, while in the 5-year gap, we have only 1 bit. So the amount of bit position that will be contributing in the 5-year gap is very limited compared to the number of bits that will be contributing to the 2-year gap one. So we just adjusting.
Is it just a random mask based on that probability?
Yes. So the masking is just a random kind of a randomly permuted one, but it has to be follow the same principle when you using in the record level Bloom filters. So once we have those masking keys, what we do is the generally bitwise AND operation, and you will get 2 new Bloom filters, and these Bloom filters are sent to the linkage unit for the comparison purposes. So in the third phase, where the linkage unit get those Bloom filters, and then in order to minimize the number of unwanted comparisons, first it does a locality sensitive hashing technique based on Hamming distance, and once it has these blocks, it will compare the the Bloom filter pairs and calculate the similarities, and then based on a threshold based classification model, it classifies them as either match or non-match. And once it finished, it sends the matching record IDs back to the database owners. That's how it works. So about the experiments, we used North Carolina voter registration dataset. We extracted 25 databases from 2014 to 2018 every 2 months, and each dataset contains 7 million records. We use first name, last name, street, city, and zip code attributes as the linkage attributes, and each of these datasets contain 3 different types of records: exact, unique, and update. Exact means no changes is occurring for a given voter. Unique means you are getting new voters into the datasets, and updated means the voters change their attribute values. And based on this dataset, we extracted a subset for 2 to 10 databases, and we extracted subset for 2 variations, where first variation contains 20% of exact matching records, while in the other one we only kept unique and updated records. In order to compare, since this is the only privacy preserving temporal record linkage process available, so we used the non-temporal linkage approach, privacy preserving approach proposed by Rainer Chanel in 2009. And we use the Bloom filter encoding as the cryptographic long-term key, where you encode all the attributes into a one single Bloom filter. And similar to our approach, they also send them to a linkage unit. So the linkage unit conduct the do the comparison based on these cryptographic long-term keys. About the evaluation measures, we use runtime to measure the scalability, and then we do this in terms of database sizes and number of databases. And the linkage quality we measured using standard measures of recall and precision. And in order to measure the privacy, we use a cryptanalysis attack proposed by Peter, Rainer, Dinush, and myself in 2017. And it's generally a frequency attack where you have an encoded Bloom filter database and you have a known plain text database, and you try to align the frequencies between them and try to re-identify which of these values, frequent values in this plain text value encoded in this encoded Bloom filters. And the accuracy of this attack is measured using one-to-one matching, where you have an exact plain text record correspond to a one Bloom filter. One-to-many means one Bloom filter correspond to many plain text values. Wrong means we are doing a wrong thing in there, and no guesses means there's no guesses at all. So about the results, we have seen that our approach takes much more runtime compared to the non-temporal approach, because at the moment we are using a training sample-based technique to calculate the decay probabilities. And at the moment we are researching how we can incorporate active learning techniques to try to minimize the time that we use in this space. And in terms of linkage quality, we have seen that it can improve the precision in a considerable manner compared to the non-temporal approach, but with a slight reduction in recall. The reduction happened because the way we encode the attribute values, since we encode each attribute value in its own Bloom filter, when we perform the blocking, the corresponding records can be appeared in two different blocks. So we have a slight reduction in recall in there. And we saw the same improvement in the other experiments we have done, and same slight reduction in the recall as well. But overall, it improves the precision in a high rate compared to the non-temporal approach. And about the privacy, one thing to note is if you use very low number of attribute values in your low number of attributes in your encoding, our approach reveals much more higher number of information compared to the cryptographic long-term key, because the way we encode. But if you increase the number of linkage attributes, it behaves in the same manner as the cryptographic long-term keys. So we have done these experiments for 2 to 5 attributes. So to conclude my presentation, we are proposing a novel privacy-preserving record linkage process which uses a secure decay probability computation plus a Bloom filter encoding based technique for comparison. Based on the experiments we've done, we've seen that it's scalable in terms of number of parties. Sorry, it has to be number of databases. It can improve the linkage quality when incorporating temporal information in the linkage process, and it provides privacy for individuals encoded in these Bloom filters if you encode much more higher number of attributes. As the future work, as I mentioned before, we try to incorporate active learning strategies, and as an extra point, we have a new approach where we eliminate the linkage unit as well, and the paper is under review at the moment, and we also experimenting with other secure Bloom filter encoding techniques as well. I hope you understood how it works, and if you have any further questions, I'm happy to answer them now. Thank you.
No, go. Okay. When you were talking about the fact you're using record level Bloom filters, there was a step where you have them all lined up and then you permute the position.
That's right.
But then in your example, you didn't have the permutation.
No, I just use it as to explain it, but more easily.
Yeah. How does that play in with the mask?
So
the mask is before the permutation.
So the permutation sequence has to be agreed by the parties, because they do the encoding process independently, and one party only generate the masking key. So he knows the permutation process, so he does the masking.
My question is probably left field. So you show that this works when you're tracking temporal changes over multiple years.
Yes.
I'm just wondering how effective this will be on like changes that happens, every few seconds. And
every few seconds.
Example, so if you're tracking a number of cars, so you know about Bayesian tracking when you're tracking one thing, right? When you're tracking multiple things at each time step, you have to solve this multi-object association problem, like which data points refers to which object,
yeah.
Which is basically this temporal record linkage problem, but you need to do that every second or every few minutes. Would this work in that setting?
It would work if you have enough information to hide the information about the entities. For an example, if the records generated at a given second is only about one particular entity, you are revealing so much of information to the other party. But if you have within that given, let's say, bank database where multiple parties are doing transaction, ATM transaction, something like that.
Think about cars.
Okay.
Sensors on traffic lights.
Okay. So if you have enough entities in that given second, then it would work. So you can have 1 second, 2 second, 3 second, likewise.
Yep. So what is going to change? What's the same? What are the features you have? Colors? No. four times.
So realistically, you're kind of looking at cameras sitting on traffic lights, doing some type of surveillance, right? On each car, maybe you can recognize the license plate, the color, the make of the car, and things like that. And you get different measurements at different kind of traffic light locations in the city. But you don't want to be so obvious right? You want to do surveillance, but in a way that's privacy preserving, in a way, right? So that you only decrypt the ones that are problematic, right? So that's the setting. Anyway, we'll talk more.
This is slightly different to your topic. The original temporal record linkage on clear text, what was the improvement in quality in that paper?
In the
original paper.
privacy preserving one.
Yeah.
In the lease approach, they did experiment with the bibliographic data set and come in, according to their paper, if I remember correctly, they have higher improvement when using temporal information in the record linkage process.
So for both precision and recall?
Yes. According to that data set they use, because it's very small.
Okay.
I can maybe add to this. I mean, one of the challenges we have is getting real data, right? And especially real data with temporal changes. So this North Carolina border database is the only resource which we really have where things change over time, and it's only because we've downloaded this every 2 months. But even in that data set, the number of changes are, there's so many people change updates.
So that's how you did the temporal part, you just downloaded it.
That's right. I mean, basically, I'm still waiting for the FBI one screeching in front of our offices. I mean, the website, there's no licensing information, there's no usage information. They upgraded it recently, but you can still download the whole thing on the zip file. So we do this, and they have a voter ID and lots of other personal information, but this allows us. Another PhD student is doing more temporal linkage without the privacy aspect. I've been using this, and so he checked the voter IDs are pretty accurate. There are still a few errors, as you would assume, in 7 million records, right? But we believe that this unique identifier is actually a voter, and so we can. I mean, he did the other last data set. It's interesting. Before every presidential election, the number of changes goes up. And for every midterm election, it goes up less, right? So you have this nice change, little change, and in between it's pretty stable. So, and only because we now have the data set since 2011, do we actually have enough changes. But it's still not, it's still only a few 100,000, I think, over a year's time out of the 7 million who update the names and addresses. So anybody, if you got any temporal information, look.
No. I was asking Peter, because to be honest, even in Australia with the kind of separation principle, we actually don't get any dates. They don't provide us with any dates. So even though we have temporal changes within the data sets, we don't know when they change.
Right.
So I was actually interested if the actual quality goes up dramatically.
I think I'm asking for it. Think about this, you know, from the ABS that, I don't know, 30% of people change their address over the 5-year census period. That has to have an influence on the linkage quality.
Yeah.
There has to be, right? But even I think the ABS cannot link over time, right? Because they can't keep names and addresses, and they have challenges as well. But
the Medicare enrollment file would be an interesting one to get because it does have the dates.
Yeah,
when
if
things
you have it
change.
again. I mean, for us, it's zero chance. I'm sure there's lots of government databases which have dates. And I guess most of you guys at Ostrac have temporal data at a distant time scale, but it will be interesting to see how, if you take that into account, how much you can actually, so kind of, what I would like to see is like, if there's a 10% temporal change over a certain period of time, how is this influencing linkage quality, right? Because I guess that could inform you guys.
Well, that's what I'm interested in. Yeah, exactly that. So taking the traditional Fleggy Sunter, where you're just taking the differences into consideration, if we had the temporal kind of change, would that improve it?
Yeah.
Just looking at your example, you have Anne Smith in Canberra.
Yeah.
And then, first of all, the last name changed because the person got married, right? And then the address changed. So, so if I'm kind of tackling this problem, I will be looking at pairwise linkages that allow some changes, local changes, and then do something like connect the component to track the changes over time.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to track, go from R2 to R5 based on those three attributes alone, you really can't make any argument that they're the same. Just want to get your thoughts around. So instead of doing the connected components separately, you kind of embedding something like that into your Bloom filter. But how far can that go in terms of the chain?
Yeah, that's right. So at the moment, I think we discussed a new approach where we generally think about, like, rather than comparing these pairwise things, like how we can do it, like we pick certain records and from that, like as you mentioned, like how we can go like in a connected mode. So at the moment it's still in the discussion mode. We might come up with a much more accurate protocol in near future.
That is the difference. The transitive closure versus the pairwise is the...
And the original temporal linkage paper does a clustering where basically they move forward in time, and I just know it's because I read Charini's summary of TPR. So basically what they kind of do an early binding, so kind of you have a record, the first one has a high similarity, you cluster together and you move forward in time. There's different ways of how you can do it. But I mean, the other thing is, even revealing you cannot reveal the dates, right? Because I mean, you could look up, well, okay, there's a change in name and address. Likely Anne got married somewhere in between, or maybe that's when she got married, right? Then you kind of go into newspaper articles and Facebook and see, okay, what that change on this profile corresponds to that person, right? That's why we have that K anonymity, kind of, we have to group things, right? Of course, in K is also a security kind of parameter which allows you to set privacy as well.
So of course they didn't get married. The person who get married is just a new roommate.
Well, of course, there's all things.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So introduce Wilco. Good segue there with the spatial. There's so many adapters here. If they can't plug in, it's your problem. Is it your charger, Tanisha? Yeah.
Random shift. The point is, yeah.
That's only I. I feel I'm doing the suit and I've got Windows system. I'm down. Okay.
Hi, everyone. So I want to take you on the journey of an exploration of an idea I had last year. And it all started with the generous donation of a dataset, NC Water datasets. Thanks, Peter. And I sampled a subset of there's got millions of records in it, and I sampled two subsets. There were 200,000 each, and they had 120,000 entities in common. And I was trying to find a good configuration for generating clicks that achieves an acceptable linkage quality of some sense. And unfortunately, I wasn't successful with the tools we got at hand at the time. And then I started looking at the dataset. And here I graph the changes of the common entities. And